We are at the end of the 40-year wilderness wandering now. And at the beginning of that 40-year period, remember that a census was taken, that all of the fighting men of Israel aged 20 and up were counted. Do you remember what that number was from the first census?
Just over 600,000.
Yeah, it was 603,550 men. Now, 39 and a half years later, a new census is going to be taken, and the total number is pretty much the same. It's 601,730. So what is that, a difference of 1,820 or something like that? Just call it 2,000 people. So this census, although the number is very similar, this, of course, is a completely different group of people. The punishment that the Israelites suffered wandering in the wilderness for 40 years was that all of those who were aged 20 and up had to die. And this is just the census of the fighting men. So there were also women and older people who were not counted in the census 40 years prior, who also had to die. Now, I want you to turn with me to Hebrews chapter 3. I want to read something that I hope will help us see the significance of this. All of these people in the wilderness dying off. Hebrews chapter 3. Let's start reading at verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. While it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? And with whom was God angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. There's a lot of things I could comment about this, but think about all of those bodies that died in the wilderness. In that 40-year period, you've got 1 million plus people who have to die in order for the next generation of Israelites to come along and go into the promised land. For 40 years, 1 million plus people have to die. How many people were dying in the camp of Israel every day when they were out there in the wilderness?
15,000.
I mean, okay. So can you imagine how much death there was in the wilderness while all of this generation has to go away? And I want you to keep that in mind when we get into Deuteronomy on Wednesday. Because in Deuteronomy, you're going to see this theme repeated again and again. Moses is going to say to the Israelites, thank you guys. Moses is going to say over and over, this is a matter of life and death. Follow God's ways and you will live. Disobey God and you will die. That meant something to that generation. This new generation of Israelites that is coming into the land, as they were children growing up, they were surrounded by death in the wilderness. They're watching people die every day. And finally, when they are of age, and this new census is done, now those younger people are 20 years and up. Now this new census is being taken. They are used to seeing people dying in the wilderness. And why does the Hebrew writer say that they died? In verse 19, he says these people were disobedient. In verse 18, he says they were disobedient. And in verse 19, he says they didn't enter because they didn't believe. Disobedience and unbelief. It's the same thing. If you don't obey God, it's because you don't actually believe God. If you obey God, it's because you believe Him. It's a matter of life and death. And these Israelites saw so much death in the wilderness. All right. All of those people who left the land of Egypt, 603,550 plus women, children, and elderly. We're well over 1 million people when you factor everyone in. All of those people who left the land of Egypt, how many of those people who came out of Egypt went into the land of Canaan? 2 people. Not even Moses. Not even Aaron. 2 people. Caleb and Joshua. I'm sorry? Only ones over 60?
Over 60 years of age. The 20-year-old cut off and then 40 years.
Well, but they were the ones who were of the spies who were faithful, right? That's ultimately where that goes back to. All right. Now, Numbers, let's go back to Numbers. Numbers 27. I really struggled with how to go about teaching today's class. Because frankly, the stuff that we're covering today is just not very exciting. You know, let's count the people. Let's divide up the land. And we're going to separate all this territory out, and it's not very exciting. I get that. But Numbers 27, as well as Numbers 36, the very last chapter, deals with a situation regarding Zelophehad's daughters. Zelophehad was their father, and he was dead. And they had a question: is there going to be some land for them in order land that they can inherit? And so they bring this question to Moses. Moses takes this to God, and God answers. And in verses 1 through 11, there's this discussion about how to make provisions for a man's family if he dies and he has no sons, if he dies and there are no other male heirs that can receive this territory, and all of that is taken care of. In chapter 36 as well, this same discussion is there. A little bit different emphasis, but it's repeated there. There are some stipulations in order for Zelophehad's daughters to keep the land that their father would have received. What are those stipulations? They have to marry within the family, okay? And that the land is not going to pass, or they have to marry within the tribe, I should say, not within the family. And the land is not going to be passed from one tribe to another, presumably because you marry outside the tribe. And then that tribe would then try to take the land over. Okay. Let's go to something a little more exciting. Numbers 27, verses 12 to 23. Joshua is named as the successor to Moses. Moses is not going to enter the promised land. We've covered that. Matt talked to you about that. Moses is not going to enter the promised land, but somebody has to lead the people in. Joshua is the most natural choice. To this point, Joshua has not received nearly as much attention that Moses has received, but Joshua has been there every step of the way. He's been something of a right-hand man to Moses. And so he is the natural choice. When Joshua is selected to be the one to take over, we've still got several weeks before Moses dies. This is not something Moses does on his deathbed. But in chapter 27, let's start reading together in verse 15. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation will not be like sheep which have no shepherd." So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. You shall put some of your authority on him, in order that all the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. Moreover, he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his command they shall go out, at his command they shall come in, both he and the sons of Israel, even all the congregation." Now verse 23, Moses laid his hands on him and commissioned him, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. This is a public presentation of Joshua, and it comes with this expectation. You follow Joshua, just like you followed me. And in fact, if you go to Joshua chapter 1, there are some things that the Lord says to Joshua that I think are important. Joshua chapter 1, I want you to see in verse 5. "No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you." Joshua, I'm going to work with you in the same way that I worked with Moses. You will be close to me. We will converse. We will talk. I will be with you. I will help you. And so the people of Israel need to understand that Joshua is not some junior officer. He's taking over. He is filling the steps of Moses, filling the position that Moses is leaving. And God is going to be with him just like he was with Moses. Now let's go to chapter 32 of Numbers. The tribes of Reuben and Gad make this request of Moses that they receive their portion of the land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. But that land on the eastern side of the Jordan was not part of the promised land that Israel was to receive. They were going to receive the territory between the Jordan and the Mediterranean on the west. So Reuben and Gad, after all of Israel has defeated Sihon on the eastern side of the Jordan, and they've conquered all of those lands, they realize, as the text says in Numbers 32, this is a land that's really good for livestock. Good fields here for cattle. And so they decide that they want this to be their land. Moses becomes very angry with them at this request. What is he angry about? Why is he mad with them? How would they do that? Okay. What do you mean you want to stop and set up your camp and establish yourself on the eastern side of the Jordan? You don't want to go in with the rest of us? We've got more fighting to do. There are more nations that need to be driven out. There's more cities that need to be occupied. And if you stay behind, our numbers go down in our military. And you don't want to come into the promised land, and this is going to discourage everybody else. What are you talking about? We had a deal here, right? We were all going to fight together and take this land. And you want a piece of land that's not even in the promised land? What are you doing? Now, Reuben and Gad quickly say to Moses, no, we're ready to help conquer all of the land. But when that's done, we want to come back to this spot. We'll go in and help. We'll fight for all the land. We're not dropping out, okay? And so they are going to receive that land on the eastern side of the Jordan River, as well as a half-tribe of Manasseh. Who was Manasseh? Do you remember? Son of Joseph, right? Joseph had 2 sons, okay? Half of the tribe of Manasseh is going to be on the eastern side of the Jordan. Half will be on the western side. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh want this eastern territory. They're willing to go into the western territory and fight for it, but they want to settle eventually on the eastern side. Okay, good. Chapter 32, when Moses is speaking to them, he says in verse 20, if you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for war, and all of you armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven his enemies out from before him, and the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you shall return and be free of obligation toward the Lord and toward Israel, and this land shall be yours for a possession before the Lord. So Moses agrees with what they have said. Okay, if you're willing to cross over the Jordan and help us fight, and then when we're finished, you want to go back over to the east side and settle, then that's fine. But then he gives this warning in verse 23, and this is a very familiar verse. But if you do not do this, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. We quote that verse a lot when we try to teach people that, you can't hide things from God. You can't hide your sinful behaviors from God, and that's true. Sins will inevitably come to light. But the context in which Moses says this is very different from the way that we usually apply it, right? I'm not taking anything away from the application that we make, but this is the context in which it's said. Wayne?
One of the things that I care mentioning is that Moses essentially accused those 2 tribes of doing the same thing that their fathers and the other tribal groups had done 40 years before that, and where they went up to look over the land and decided they couldn't go because of the fighting and people
Yeah,
on the street.
that's right. That's a great point. I think the authors of the book make that point as well, that one of the things Moses is concerned about is he's probably thinking about 40 years previous, when the 12 spies went into the land and 10 of them came back with a fearful report, and it discouraged the whole nation. And they were then punished for 40 years, having to wander in the wilderness. And Moses, seeing Reuben and Gad say, well, we want to do this. We want to stay on the eastern side. He's worried that too will discourage the rest of the people, just like the 10 spies did 40 years previously. And so he doesn't want to repeat that episode. Moses doesn't want to wander for 40 more years. Okay? All right, good. In chapter 33, you have a detailed account of all of the places that the Israelites traveled to in their 40-year wandering. Some of the places that you read about in chapter 33 are names that we don't recognize. And that's not because Moses just made them up and they don't actually exist. Remember that as they were wandering in the wilderness, oftentimes they camped outside of cities, far outside cities, because remember, what did the Edomites tell them when they wanted to pass through their territory? No, right? They were very rarely getting close to cities, so close to a city that they could partake of the city's resources. That rarely happened. And so oftentimes what happens is when we read through this, it'll say, well, they camped near such and such a place that we recognize. You know, they camped near Greenville, but they were actually in Tigerville, you know, something like that. So a lot of these places are places that are just out in the wilderness. And perhaps Moses and the Israelites gave names to these places as they went to them, but they weren't cities that they were traveling to. But some of these places in chapter 33 we do recognize because the scriptures have talked about their stop in earlier chapters in Exodus and in Numbers. Did you have your hand up, Glenn?
I was just thinking as you were talking, staying away from the cities. Can you imagine a city, 1 million people plus, coming in and decimate all your resources?
Yeah.
You know, of course they're going to.
Absolutely. Right. That's right. And we've talked about that in earlier classes, just the sheer problems that would have been created by that many people coming into a populated area. Okay, good. All right, so what we're going to do for the rest of class is just read through Numbers 33 and pronounce all of these places. And we're going to do this together. No, we're not going to do that. Okay, do look, though, at the end of chapter 33 and verse 50. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it." Okay, you look at those words in verse 52, the things that he instructs them to do. Destroy, demolish. Okay. You think the Israelites have pretty clear instructions? Of all the things that they are told to do, when they come into the land and they see these foreign nations, is there any doubt as to what they are supposed to do to these foreign nations and to all the things that they possessed, all of the religious artifacts that they used? What are the Israelites supposed to do? Destroy, demolish. I mean, these are strong words. The book of Deuteronomy has even more to say about this. Deuteronomy 7 in particular talks about these Canaanite nations and what they are supposed to do when they come into the land. God makes it very plain. You make it as if these nations never existed. That's their instruction. All right, let's continue. You shall inherit, this is verse 54, inherit the land by lot according to your families. To the larger you shall give more inheritance, and to the smaller you shall give less inheritance. How would they determine larger and smaller? Well, what have they just done? They just took the census again. Okay? So the tribes that are larger get more land, the tribes that are smaller get less land. That seems fair, doesn't it? All right, verse 55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides. and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. What does he plan to do to them? What were those words in verse 52? Destroy, demolish, annihilate, okay? And if you don't do that, and you let them remain in the land, and then you become like them, I will do to you what I'm telling you to do to them. And you know what? That's exactly what happens. This is a very serious warning given to the people. It is better to obey God and do exactly as he says so that these things will go well. This expression in verse 55, if you let them remain, they will become as pricks in your eyes. Can you imagine getting a splinter in your eye? Doesn't that sound terrible? That's kind of the image that I get when I read that. How uncomfortable that would be. Thorns in your sides. That's an expression we use commonly. We understand that. But God says these people will trouble you. So it's best to just get rid of them. All right. Chapter 34. The boundaries of the promised land. Now, we've already mentioned that this land on the eastern side was not part of the original promised land. It was just going to be here, the Jordan down to the Dead Sea was going to be the eastern boundary. So on this eastern side, we'll use that as the boundary. And then to the south, you've got the land of Edom down here in the purple. Follow this green down here to Kadesh Barnea, where they spent a lot of time. Okay? Follow that over to the western boundary of the Mediterranean Sea. Basically, all of this in green that you see is going to be the Israelites' territory. And all of that land is going to be divided among the tribes, with the exception of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh that's on the east side. Yes, sir.
It says half-tribe of Manasseh. They also refer to the half-tribe of Ephraim.
Right.
Is that half of the half-tribe, or is that...
Math is hard, Glenn. I don't understand.
Okay.
No, it was a full tribe, okay? It's just half of them settled on the east side and half of them settled on the west side. But it's still considered a full tribe, just like all the other ones.
Okay, because a lot of times it refers to them as half-tribe of Manasseh.
Yeah,
Half-tribe
right.
of Ephraim, because they were the two sons divided from Joseph.
Right. Yes, that's right. But those two sons of Joseph were, in Genesis 49 talks about this, when Jacob is blessing all of his sons, he blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, and it specifically mentions there about them receiving a full inheritance just like his other sons. Okay? So when it talks about a half tribe, it's not saying that they are lesser of a tribe. It's just talking about how they split it in the appropriation of the land. Okay? Yeah, good question. Okay, anything else? Kyle.
On your last slide, you actually had a note, sort of, or actually, maybe one before that. It was about, one before that. The one where it said
Okay, Kyle.
Joseph, it said that Joseph, the Manasseh.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, at the bottom, Joseph's sons received a complete share. In this way, Joseph received his two complete shares, because when he was blessed, he was given a double
Yeah,
share.
right. So both of his sons got full inheritance. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's go to chapter 35. And let's talk about the cities of the Levites and the cities of refuge. Well, okay, I thought there was a water bottle up there, but there's not. Okay. Cities of the Levites. Numbers 35. Matt, it's okay, don't worry about it. Well, I've only got a few more minutes. Remember that the Levites were not given a portion of land. like everybody else. They did not have a segment of the promised land that belonged to them, but they've got to live somewhere. And so what they do is there are cities scattered throughout the land that are provided for the Levites. There's 48 cities, thank you, in total that are provided for the Levites. 6 of those are cities of refuge, and then there's 42 additional cities. Now, the tribe of Levi, of course, is the priestly tribe. And remember this bottom part of the slide. The Levites were to teach the law to the Israelites. I know I've said this half a dozen times already this quarter. But when you think about the priests, don't just think about them making sacrifices and serving at the altar. That was just half of their job. The other half of their job was to be teachers of the law. And so when you think about what the Levites had to do in teaching the law to the nation, then having cities scattered throughout the promised land where the priests lived makes a lot of sense. If the tribe of Levi was given a portion of land far away from other tribes, well, how would they ever be taught the way that they need to be taught unless they travel up to where the Levites are or the Levites travel down to them? But if you scatter the teachers throughout the land, everybody has easier access to the Word of God. So this makes a lot of sense. So 48 cities are given that the Levites are going to live in. And they're going to be provided for through the tithing of the people, giving of the 10%. That's going to go to the Levites so that they can have farms and lands and they can be provided for and have their needs met. Now, among these 48 cities, 6 of them were cities of refuge. And these were cities where people who accidentally killed another person could flee to and be guaranteed to have a fair judgment, a fair trial. These were, now I don't know about you, it's kind of hard for me to think about a whole lot of scenarios where I might accidentally kill somebody, okay? But, I mean, I suppose an obvious situation would be like, say, a car accident, right? That obviously you didn't set out to do that, but you made a mistake, it was your fault, and tragically someone died, right? In that kind of a situation, you could flee to a city of refuge, and you would be guaranteed safety. No one could come after you and take vengeance on you until you had a fair trial. There are some situations that are discussed in the scripture about how someone might accidentally kill another person. But these cities of refuge were places where these guilty ones, though accidentally, could flee to and have safety. Now, I think it might be my next. No, okay. If you fled to a city of refuge because you accidentally took another person's life, you were tried, and it was understood that it was an accident, then you were free to go back home. I think maybe the idea of a city of refuge for us is a little bit bizarre because our justice system doesn't work this way, right? We have measures in place for our justice system to handle wrongful death situations and accidental death situations. But this was this was the way for them to handle this. And the Levites would have been a part of this as well, seeing that these were cities that were under their authority, cities that belonged to them. Somebody who intentionally killed another person, could he flee to the city of refuge and find safety? No. If you intentionally killed someone, you could not go to the city of refuge and find safety. And in fact, you were going to most likely be pursued and vengeance overtake you. But that was not the design. The design of the cities of refuge were for accidental death situations. In the lands east of the Jordan, where Gad and Reuben and Manasseh on the east side, 3 cities, Golan, Ramoth, and Bezer, were taken as 3 cities of refuge on the east side of the Jordan. And then there would be more added on the west side shortly. Okay, thanks everybody. Today was a struggle for me vocally. Sorry for that. Thank you for bearing with me.